Hey guys, Kara Jane with Ice Cream for Buttercream, and today we're going to talk about how to get moist cakes. So this is a problem that I hear about a lot, is people have trouble with getting their cakes to come out moist and not dry. So most of the time when I hear about this problem is with scratch cake recipes. So most of the time everybody gets along well with cake mix cake because that's what the purpose is for a cake mix cake. Is it has all these added ingredients in there to make it come out consistent and moist. But a lot of people have trouble with their scratch cakes coming out moist. So I put together some tips and some things to think about that I think will really help you. And so one caveat I will tell you about, I know that some people have an issue with the word moist. So I don't really have an issue with it, but I have friends who, and I have seen other people who don't like to hear the word moist, and it just grates on their nerves. So I'm going to give you a warning. I use the word moist in this video a lot, so just be prepared. So let's get on to the tips.
Okay, first, if you're coming from YouTube, I will put a link in the description below for my two favorite scratch cake recipes. The first is my favorite vanilla bean cake recipe, and the second is my chocolate butter cake. Both of these are scratch cakes. I love them both. They're very moist, and I think you're really going to like them. And if you're not coming from YouTube and you're watching this on Facebook or the post, there are links to these two recipes in the post as well. Tip number 1, you need real butter. Stay away from the margarine. So first I'm going to tell you to check your butter. You may say, I am using butter. And what I want to tell you is that sometimes they try to trick you in the grocery store. So when you're buying butter, make sure to look and make sure it's actual butter, because sometimes the margarine will come in sticks, and sometimes it even says on the box, great for baking. But I'm going to tell you, the one that says great for baking, sometimes that's not butter, and it's actually margarine, and margarine has more water content in it, and it just doesn't work as well as butter. So check your butter. If your cakes are coming out dry, that's the first thing I would do, is check and make sure it's not margarine, that it's actually real butter. And then the second thing about butter is you want to make sure, most of the recipes call for room temperature butter, and room temperature is great, or maybe slightly cooler than room temperature. You don't want cold, and you don't want to put that butter in the microwave and heat it up and have it all melted. That does not work. They say room temperature because room temperature ingredients mix together better. All right, tip number 2 is, are you measuring your flour correctly? So you don't want to pack down your flour when you're measuring it. And by that I mean you don't want to take your measuring cup and stick it into the flour bag and measure out a cup of flour that way, because you're packing the flour down into your measuring cup. So take your measuring cup, set it to the side of your flour bag, and then take another scoop it out of the flour bag, and then put it into your measuring cup that way. So you're just spooning it into your measuring cup and measure that, and then make sure to level off the top. So that's how you measure your flour. Just remember, don't pack your flour down into your measuring cup, because that's going to be adding too much flour to your cake batter. Tip number 3, are you using all egg whites instead of whole eggs? Now, I know that there are some white cake recipes that do call for all egg whites, and that's fine. If you're having no trouble with those recipes, go ahead and keep on using them. But if this cake is coming out too dry, it could be that it's all egg whites, because egg whites are a little drying. When you use whole eggs in place of the egg whites, it seems to add a little bit more moisture. Now, there are some cake recipes that you're not going to be able to do this with. So if it's like a chiffon cake or something where you're having to beat and whip the egg whites until they're stiff and then fold them into the batter, that's a totally different type of recipe, and you're going to have to continue to use egg whites for that particular cake recipe. But for general cakes, you can, if it's calling for all egg whites, you can add whole eggs instead of the egg whites. You don't want to, let's say your recipe is calling for 6 egg whites. You don't want to add 6 eggs. You're going to completely half that amount. So you would use 3 whole eggs instead of the 6 egg whites. You're not going to get a bright white cake, but you might get a little bit more moist cake doing it that way. Tip number 4, don't overbake, especially vanilla cakes. And the trick that I use for vanilla cakes is that right before I think they're ready, I'll pull them out. Now, if you pull them out too far ahead, you're going to set them on your counter, and then they're going to sink in the middle because they won't be done. So obviously you want the middle done, but you don't want them brown too much on the top, because vanilla cakes are notorious for being dry if you overbake them even just slightly. So this is going to take a little bit of trial and error. But if you find that you're overbaking, just whenever you think that they're going to be ready, just take them out just slightly before then. That just seems to work best for me. Tip number 5, stop over mixing. So when you're using a cake mix recipe, which normally people don't have a problem with the cake mixes coming out dry, because that's what a cake mix is for. You're supposed to get a consistent product every time, and usually they do come out moist because they've got all the other additives and ingredients in the box. But if you're using a scratch cake, you do not want to mix it like you're going to mix a cake box cake. You have to follow the instructions. If it tells you to mix it for 1 minute, mix it for 1 minute. But you don't want to pulverize it where you're not seeing any kind of lumps or anything in your cake batter. You want to just completely follow the instructions as they're written. If you overmix your scratch cake batter, you could end up with a cake that is way too dense, a flat cake, a cake that doesn't rise properly. It can be sort of a gummy consistency. You could have these glue-like streaks in it. You can have sort of little tunnels in it. There's all kinds of things that can happen if you overmix, and the texture's just not going to be right. And obviously it's not going to be moist. It's going to have just a weird texture. So I always try to tell people, if you're doing something, if you're baking from scratch, try to stop yourself from overmixing the batter. Tip number 6, it's not always your fault. So I'm going to just give you an excuse here. Sometimes it's really not your fault. You have followed the instructions exactly. You have used the mixing method that the instructions told you to use, and everything you have done is exactly the way you were supposed to, but the recipe, the cake is still just not coming out correctly. It could actually be the recipe. Sometimes it is. I always try to tell people, follow the instructions exactly how they're written, and if you try it a couple of times, you know that you are using all butter, you're not packing down your flour, you haven't overbaked it, it's still not working out. It could be the recipe, and you might just need to try a different recipe, and that's okay too. Tip number 7 is say yes to sour cream. And a lot of people, when they hear the cake recipe has sour cream in it, if they don't like sour cream, they're like, ew. Well, it doesn't taste like sour cream, obviously. But sour cream is so much thicker. It gives the cake a really moist consistency. It really makes for a smooth texture of cake. And I love using sour cream. Most of my recipes call for sour cream, because to me, it really makes for a soft consistency, moist cake. Tip number 8, cakes calling for oil seem to be more moist. Now, I will say that not all cake recipes call for oil, obviously, but a lot of the fruit cakes, such as, and I don't mean fruit cake as in like the door stoppers for Christmas, but I mean cakes that are like carrot cake or the apple cakes, zucchini cakes, banana cakes, things like that. A lot of those call for oil, and it really makes the cake more moist. But some cakes you really don't want that in there. So for example, vanilla cakes. I really haven't found a vanilla cake that just calls for oil that I really care for. It's because the fruit cakes seem to have a stronger flavor because of the fruit that's coming out, and they can sort of overcome that oil taste. But a vanilla cake is such a light flavor. Vanilla cakes taste much better when you've got a butter recipe. And again, you can find that recipe for my favorite vanilla bean cake in the blog post or in the description below, and it actually does call for butter. Tip number 9 is you could try a simple syrup. And a simple syrup is just equal parts of water and sugar, and it's boiled together. And it's just a liquid, and you're just going to spray it over your cake layers, or you're going to put it in sort of a squeeze bottle and then squeeze it over the top of your cake layers. You want it to soak in a little bit before you then add the buttercream on the top of it. And I have heard a lot of people like to use the simple syrup, and sometimes they like to infuse different flavors into their simple syrup. I don't use this method a lot, but I have heard a lot of people really love it. Tip number 10. Is your cake really dry, or is it just cold? Okay, I'm not trying to be condescending here. I'm being serious, sort of. But I have had people, and I'm on some of these cake forums sometimes, and they do have clients who will say the cake was dry. But what happened was that the cake was cold because it was in the refrigerator. And so when they brought it out, they cut it and started to eat it. Well, if you've got a butter cake, cakes that are made with butter, they're notorious for getting firmer and a little bit harder because they're in the fridge, because it's got butter in it. So when you pull it out of the fridge, let it sit there for a while and come to room temperature. Obviously, if you've got a cake that has perishable fillings and things in it, you don't want to just leave it out, but you want it to come to room temperature, then cut it and eat it. Because if you're eating a cold cake, the consistency or the texture is more firm and it's going to taste dry, but it's not actually dry, it's just cold. So try that. Just see if you're trying to eat it cold, and if so, let it come to room temperature and see if that makes a difference. All right, and last, I just want to tell you to always follow the instructions in the cake recipe. Follow them to a T because they matter. The temperature of the ingredients matter, and the mixing method matters. If they're telling you to alternate between the dry and the wet ingredients when you're mixing, do that. If they're telling you to use the reverse creaming method, use that because it matters in what order you're going to add your ingredients and mix them together. Because the person who has written the recipe knows how best to add the ingredients together for the optimal outcome. So before adding in anything or subbing out ingredients, always follow the directions the way they're written first, and then you can go back and kind of fiddle with flavors and things like that. Okay, and finally, don't forget to grab those two recipes I told you about, the favorite vanilla bean cake and the chocolate butter cake. They're really good, really moist, and just like I said, they're just my favorites. So I'll put a link to those in the blog post, and they're also in the description if you're watching this from YouTube. All right, I hope this was helpful to you, and if you have some tips that I may have missed, I'd love to hear them. And if you try either one of those two recipes I recommended, I'd love to hear what you thought. Okay, I'll see you next time.